Welcome back to Of Gods and Gamemasters, and to my world-building series, starting from the pantheon of gods and moving through the ages from creation to the start of the campaign. Last episode we covered Vizantos, the evil empire. This episode, Skaria, life on the border. If you want to support what I do, like, subscribe, and hit the bell for notifications. My Patreon and other links are in the description. So are links to the reference sheet for the gods to help you keep up. Without further ado, let's get into it. We've previously established that Skaria is the easternmost of the successor states of Rega, and that its culture partakes of Rome and of ancient Dacia, and of Hungary and Romania, circa 1100 AD in our world. In this episode, we'll explore how that is expressed, especially in the light of the Gods of Rega, and even more so, their patron gods, Savios and Ignia. Also important to the discussion is the intermittent threat of barbarian raids, and the ever-present threat of Vizantos. The other interesting thing to note is that honestly, Skaria is probably the best nation for the game to be directly set in, with the most potential conflict. So we'll be working toward that, and toward picking a town for our starting home base. In the description, there's a link to a new map, zoomed in on Skaria, that may help with following along, and the map itself is also somewhere here off to the left of my head. In keeping with our practice so far, we'll start at the macro picture before moving to the micro. That means, in this case, starting with the general geography and culture of the region. These two are inextricably tied together, as cultures reflect their surroundings as well as their origins. The easternmost edge of the nation of Skaria is an extremely forbidding mountain range with only a few passes. Given the eastern threat of Vizantos, every one of those passes is guarded by a formidable fortress. We'll cover those a little later on. Right against the mountains are high-rolling foothills, fairly heavily forested. As we move west, rivers flow down through the hills into still rolling plains, lightly forested, before they meet up with rivers from the north in a much thicker forest. North of that forest, we head back up into the hills and mountains, though they don't block the north entirely. Since the barbarians are raiders, not invaders per se, there are less fortresses up here and more roving patrols. To the west, a sequence of lakes on the north and south river are flanked by a large number of settlements, well protected by the interior, and a lot of flatter, more arable farmland. On the far west, the border with Theodonia is barely patrolled. At the very southern border, all the rivers end in a river delta that has been almost entirely overtaken by the fortified capital city. We'll name that below as well. So, with all that in mind, we're looking at a very defensive-minded warrior culture. They're under constant assault from the east, or so it feels, with sporadic but horrific raids from the north. Every settlement is walled. Every grown person is involved with the militia, and a larger than normal percentage are full-time soldiers and guards. The predominance of the worship of Savios and his daughter means that their commandments are taken the most seriously, and result in a very proud warrior tradition that blends a focus on personal prowess and glory with an absolute insistence on discipline and teamwork. Axes and hammers, especially long enough to be wielded from horseback, are very common personal weapons, with the sword only keeping pace due to the ease of its carry and utility. The most common swords are curved or straight, cavalry weapons balanced for one-handed use. Note that for 5e purposes, these are not scimitars. They are not finesse weapons, and they're not long swords. There's no extended hilt. Instead, they're in an in-between place and would probably do 1-8 slashing without versatile. In GURPS, they'd be standard broadswords, whether curved or straight, double-edged or single. There would be other weapons as well, especially amongst the infantry. They might still use a version of the Dacian falx. They would probably have copis, much like the Spanish falcata. Although they are anachronistic, there is no reason to deny ourselves the coolness of actual great swords, long swords, etc. They would have leftover gladii from Rega, They probably wouldn't have rapiers here. Not even counting the anachronism of it, such weapons are better suited to dueling than war. They would have shorter scimitars, of course, if only captured from Byzantines. Given the time period equivalent, the best armor generally available is going to be chainmail. In a more Eastern style, although old suits of plate and half-plate and splint and the like might be left over from the Empire or available from the dwarves. Scale and lamellar would likely be just as common. So that's the military side of the culture, but there's so much more. The clothing would be a mixture of influences as well, most of which are still roughly equivalent to the influences on Hungary and Romania at the equivalent time. But they still worship the Regan gods, which means the Regan influence, equivalent to Roman, is much greater. So maybe togas are still worn for formal occasions. Regan styles like short tunics might still be in vogue, at least in summer. However, being further north and in the mountains, for much of the year, tunics are longer and heavier, and are often worn with fur-lined coats and fur hats. Brightly colored sashes beneath belts are the norm, whatever the length of the tunic, and undertunics often have quite long sleeves. Brays or breeches are of linen, but in the colder climes, folk often wear wool trousers. There's one very distinct effect on clothing from the gods as well. Ignia dresses as a man would, so there is no stigma attached to a woman dressing as a man might. Which is a good segue into our next part. Across all of Rega, several of the gods are known to be of what, in our world, would have been considered deviant sexualities at the time. But as they are the gods, and man tries to emulate the gods, no form of homosexuality or bisexuality suffers stigma in the successor states, nor do non-binary or transgender people. In fact, there are sacred social and mystic rituals allowing the change of one's form to fit one's identity, and gender roles are flexible. Love is considered love, whatever the form, as long as it is between consenting adults. Adulthood is considered to occur around 15 years old for humans, but adulthood rituals can be delayed for late bloomers with little stigma. In addition to their soldiers and their warriors, the Skarian people revere smiths and crafters because of their widespread worship of Ignia. Armorers and weaponsmiths are important, but so too are wheelwrights, engineers, miners, masons, all the people that keep the machine of war running and agriculture possible. Nobles are only respected if they're competent warriors or administrators. They're expected to earn respect, and they know this. So hereditary nobles are trained very carefully to fulfill their duties as both fighters and leaders, and are often craftsmen of some kind as well. Merchants are seen as a kind of necessary evil, however rich they might be. Gold is never a substitute for good manners, competence, or noble blood. Most of the people of Skaria live simple lives, possessing no more than they need and eschewing extravagance. The one exception is their love of brightly colored cloth, which merchants make quite a killing on. In truth, though, Skaria's main import is people. People who come here voluntarily to bolster the defense of the successor states against Vizantos. So the nation is more multicultural than many, with warriors from as far away as far Hesperia, mixing with Celtians and Theodonians. Skaria exists in a state of perpetual war. Unsurprisingly, it is, and always has been, ruled by warrior nobles. The supreme general, the supreme ruler, is the commanding general of all the militias and guards and armies of Skaria and its allies, so long as they operate in Skarian territory or eastward. Thus, they are called warlord, or as it would have been said in Hungary and Wallachia, voivode. Skaria, being egalitarian in terms of gender and strongly worshipping Ignia, we're going to take advantage of that and make our voivode a woman. Her name is Alexandra Regulova, and like all voivodes, she was basically elected by the Duma, or Assembly of War Leaders, called boyars. She is also Grand Duchess of the region holding the capital, which we'll name below. We're going to go ahead and put some names to regions and such before we wrap this video up. All the names for human areas are cobbled together from Googled sources. I've mixed ancient Dacian, Proto-Celtic, Latin with medieval Romanian and Hungarian. Mostly Dacian, especially around the east, using the Dova or Dava suffix for fortresses. But the capital is named in Proto-Celtic, Litwadun, which means coastal fort, because there's been a settlement there even before the people the Regans conquered. The western plains we'll call Alfold for the similar plains in Hungary. They are huge and important, so we'll make them a grand duchy belonging to the Vavud. The northern regions off the map we will call Halikina, an ancient name for Galicia. The tribes to the north we will call the Skiri, or Pure Ones, for a tribe that historically lived in Galicia, although they will actually have many different tribal names. So, the border area where they were driven back we will call Skiritot, from the Dacian word for country, with the Skiri name for themselves. It's a border territory, so we'll call it a Margravet, from Margrave or Margraf, literally border count. The rest of the regional names are some variation of the Dacian suffix dina, din, or dinas, meaning region, and named for their main settlement. The settlements are all named with some variation of the suffix dava, dov, or dova, meaning fortress in Dacian. Balasdova, for instance, means strong fortress and is placed at the widest pass. Its territory is the Duchy of Balostinas. You get the idea. Several of the territories on the mountains are margravets, so our high nobles are dukes or duchesses, grand dukes or duchesses rather, of which there is one, margraves or margravinas, of which there are 3, or dukes, of which there are 3. This gives us a neat high council or Duma of 7 members, with the remaining nobles forming the lesser council as boyars, baronets, barons, viscounts, and counts, who all owe fealty to one of the 7 above. The nobility is hereditary, usually inherited by the eldest, but the Duma must approve the ascension. If they do not, they can choose someone else who is in the line of succession. We'll go ahead and wind down there for today. Join us next time for Skaria, Threats and Allies, wherein we examine threats both internal and external, and the technically independent settlements of the Elven and Dwarven people.